I couldn't remember the last time I'd been this thrilled to get off work early. All day, I'd been mentally preparing for the usual grind of my night shift, convinced I'd be stuck there until sunrise. But then, right at the last second, my supervisor gave me the green light to leave by 11 p.m. I didn't waste a second. I practically bolted out the door, grinning like a fool. The thought of surprising my wife, Mia, had me on cloud nine. I could already see her reaction, the way her face would light up when I walked through the door hours earlier than she'd expect. The idea of finally relaxing together after a long day gave me the energy I didn't know I had. Feeling like a kid with a secret, I swung by the store, grabbed a bottle of wine, and picked out some flowers. But as I pulled into the driveway, a strange feeling crept in. Mia's car wasn't there, and the house was completely dark. Maybe she ran out for something, I told myself, shaking off the unease crawling up my spine. Still, the eerie silence hit me the second I stepped inside. No lights, no sounds, no sign of her anywhere. Where could she be? I muttered, pulling out my phone. My fingers drummed impatiently on the counter as I dialed her number. When she finally answered, her voice caught me off guard. It was flat, distant, almost irritated. "Hey, Mia, where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my enthusiasm alive. There was a long pause. Too long. Then she finally replied, her tone icy and detached. "I'm not coming home tonight." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. "What do you mean you're not coming home?" I asked, my voice laced with confusion. "Did I stutter, Leo?" She snapped, her irritation cutting right through me. "I said I have someone to take care of." A sick, heavy knot twisted in my stomach as I tried to process what she'd just said. Mia had never spoken to me like that before. So cold, so dismissive. Confusion quickly morphed into anger as I tightened my grip on the phone. "Mia, what the hell is going on? Why are you talking to me like this?" I demanded, frustration boiling over. But it was pointless. She'd already hung up. I stood there in the oppressive silence of our dark, empty house, the weight of her words pressing down on me. None of this made sense. Her behavior wasn't just out of character. It was downright cruel. My jaw clenched as I glanced out the window at the still empty driveway. Whatever was going on, I was going to find out. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my thoughts racing as I waited for her to come home. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. Eventually, I heard her car pull into the driveway. My heart pounded as the front door creaked open, and there she was, walking in like nothing had happened. "Morning," she said casually, not even glancing in my direction as she headed upstairs. "I'm going to shower," she tossed over her shoulder, as if everything was perfectly normal. I stared after her, my frustration bubbling over. Not a single explanation. No apology. Just a breezy morning like the night before hadn't happened. I bit my tongue, though, forcing myself to stay quiet. Let her think she could brush this off. She thought she'd gotten away with it, at least for the moment. As soon as I heard the shower running upstairs, something snapped inside me, propelling me outside to her car. The engine was still warm, and my hands were trembling as I slid into the driver's seat. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I reached for the navigation tablet, scrolling through her recent destinations. One address stood out like a glaring neon sign, 251 Oak Ridge Drive. I stared at it, my stomach churning. Why the hell would she have been at some house on the other side of town all night? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Without thinking, I popped open the glove compartment. I didn't even know what I was looking for, or maybe I did. And there it was. An open box of protection, one missing. The air felt like it had been punched out of me. Mia and I hadn't used birth control in years. There was absolutely no reason for those to be here. Betrayal hit me like a tidal wave as the pieces clicked into place in the ugliest way imaginable. Barely able to hold it together, I stumbled back into the house, collapsing into a chair at the kitchen table. My hands were balled into fists, knuckles white. I waited in silence, the seconds crawling by like hours until I heard her footsteps coming down the stairs. She walked into the room, her hair damp and a towel wrapped around her head. She stopped short when she saw my face. "What?" she said, her voice already defensive. "We need to talk," I said, fighting to keep my tone even. She rolled her eyes. "About what now?" I didn't blink. "Where you were last night." Her posture stiffened, her face darkening as she crossed her arms. "Are you serious, Leo? Did you go through my car? My stuff? Just answer the question," I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I held up her car keys, my grip tight. "Whose house is 251 Oak Ridge Drive? Why were you there all night?" Her expression shifted, guilt, anger, maybe even a flash of defiance. Then she straightened, her eyes cold as ice. "It's Oliver's house," she said flatly. My heart dropped like a stone. "Oliver?" She didn't flinch. "The guy from my office." "Yeah." I stayed the night there. The fury bubbling beneath my skin broke through. "You think I'm stupid, Mia? You spend the night at some guy's house. I find that in your car." I gestured sharply toward the driveway. "And you expect me to believe nothing happened?" Her eyes narrowed, her voice laced with venom. "So what if I stayed there? It's not what you think. Then what is it, Mia?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Is he your lover?" She let out a slow, exasperated sigh, her tone softening slightly but not enough to ease the tension. "No, Leo. Oliver isn't my lover." I glared at her, barely holding on to what was left of my patience. "Then why the hell were you at his house?" My voice cracked, anger giving way to desperation. "Don't even think about lying to me. I deserve the truth." Her shoulders sagged slightly, her posture shifting as though a decision had been made. Her arms fell to her sides, and her expression hardened into something colder. "Look," she said sharply, "I've been having problems at work. Okay? Oliver has been covering for me, helping me out in front of the bosses. If he hadn't stepped in, I could have lost my job." I stared at her, trying to process her words, but the explanation felt thin, fragile, like a thread that might snap with the slightest tug. And yet, she stood there, glaring at me, daring me to challenge her. "Thank him," I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "So you decided to sleep with him out of gratitude?" Mia didn't even flinch. She met my gaze without an ounce of shame. "It was my idea, Leo," she said bluntly. "I didn't ask for anything. I just knew he was attracted to me, and I decided to give him something in return for his favor." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. "You gave him something? Are you seriously saying you were with him just to thank him?" She nodded, as calm and detached as if she were explaining the weather. "Yes," she replied flatly. "It wasn't cheating, Leo. It was just a transaction. Voluntary. Honest. No feelings involved." I stared at her, completely floored. The coldness in her voice, the way she spoke about it, like it was some calculated move on a checklist, was almost too much to comprehend. "You sold yourself to keep your job?" I asked, each word tasting like venom as it left my mouth. She shrugged like it was nothing. "I gave him a little happiness for his help. That's all." My chest tightened, the pain of her words cutting deeper than I thought possible. "Mia," I choked out, my voice trembling. "How could you even think that was okay?" Her response came with a casual shrug. "It was a professional courtesy. He did me a favor. I returned it. End of story." It wasn't the end of the story for me, though. My world was falling apart, the weight of her betrayal suffocating me. But Mia? She looked as indifferent as ever, her calm demeanor making me sick. "Leo," she continued, her tone unsettlingly gentle, "there's no need to dwell on this. Sure, you're upset, but you're my husband. I love you. One night, a mistake, shouldn't be the reason we throw away everything we have." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like this wasn't the most earth-shattering revelation of my life, as if it was just a minor hiccup. My head spun with disbelief. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. No, she was treating this like it was something trivial, something we could sweep under the rug and forget. "Let's just move past this," she added, her tone light, like she was suggesting we skip dessert. I couldn't even speak. My throat was tight, my mouth dry. I just sat there, frozen in stunned silence. That's when her eyes drifted to the bouquet on the counter, the flowers I'd picked out the night before to surprise her. She smiled. "Wow, honey, are these for me?" she asked, her voice soft with admiration as she ran her fingers over the petals like nothing had happened. Before I could respond, she turned to the wine bottle I'd bought, uncorking it with practiced ease. She poured 2 glasses, handing me one as if everything was fine, as if we were celebrating something. Raising her glass in a casual toast, she said, "Leo, I'm sorry. Maybe I acted stupidly, but let's just forget about it and move on." Her tone was almost playful, like this was some minor misunderstanding. I didn't move, couldn't. I just stared at her, my mind reeling, as she took a sip of wine, her expression unbothered. How could she act so normal, so casual? It was like the woman I thought I knew had disappeared. Mia sipped her wine, studying me over the rim of her glass. The way she dismissed everything so casually, like her charm could somehow erase what she'd done, made my blood boil. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even pretending to be. To her, this was just another ordinary day. Without a word, I drained my glass and stood up abruptly. Mia tilted her head, giving me a curious look, but I couldn't stay in that room another second. The air felt thick with her lies, suffocating me. I needed space. I stepped outside, letting the cool morning air hit my face as I tried to steady my breathing. Pacing back and forth on the porch, I let the weight of everything sink in. Her betrayal was one thing, it was devastating. But the way she acted, like it didn't matter, stung even more. She expected me to sit back and play the fool, to keep being the doting, naive husband while she carried on with her double life. But I wasn't going to let that happen. This wasn't a mistake, I realized. It wasn't some drunken lapse in judgment. The way she'd acted, the sheer lack of remorse, made it clear. This was a choice. She had chosen to betray me, to lie, and then to look me in the eyes like it was no big deal. She thought she could get away with it. She thought I'd forgive and forget. But she was wrong. If Mia wanted to play games, fine. I'd play along. But this time it would be on my terms. As I stood there watching the sunrise, a plan began to take shape in my mind. If Mia's career was so important that she was willing to throw away her marriage for it, then that would be my angle. Her job, the one thing she seemed to value more than anything else, was the perfect place to strike. A calm, calculated kind of revenge. Something subtle, something she wouldn't see coming. The more I thought about it, the clearer my plan became. Mia wanted me to feel like an idiot, to believe her lies, to think she was still in control. Fine. I'd let her think she'd won. But before I handed her those divorce papers, before she thought she could walk away unscathed, I'd make sure she felt the sting of her own choices. Something small, elegant, and unforgettable. For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Watching the world slowly wake up around me, I allowed myself a tight smile. Mia thought she was in charge, but she was about to find out what it felt like to be played. I'd need to talk to a lawyer, that much was clear. But first, I had a little surprise to plan. Taking a deep breath, I headed back inside, ready to keep up the act. "Mia," I called out, stepping into the kitchen. She was still there, sipping her wine with a smug, satisfied look on her face. Her expression shifted slightly when she saw me, her features softening as she noticed the change in my tone. I forced a small, weary smile and slid back into my seat across from her, masking the storm of emotions raging just beneath the surface. "I've been thinking," I began, letting out a sigh that could have been mistaken for defeat. Her eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips. She seemed almost surprised by my words. "Maybe you're right," I continued, leaning back just enough to feign acceptance. "We've been through so much together. One mistake. It shouldn't tear us apart." Her smile grew, her gaze warm as if she hadn't expected me to come around so easily. That's exactly what I wanted. Let her think I was buying it. Let her think I was still under her spell. For now. "So agreeable," Mia said, her tone brimming with pride, as though she just scored a great victory. "I knew you'd see reason, Leo. We're stronger than this." I gave her a slow nod, forcing a smile I hoped looked sincere. "Let's move on," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I don't want to lose what we've built." She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers and giving it a reassuring squeeze, as if her betrayal had already faded into the background. To her, everything was falling neatly back into place. But in my mind, I was already several steps ahead. She was walking right into my hands, and she didn't even know it. The next morning, I headed to work with a crystal-clear mission. I marched straight into my boss Noah's office, knocking on the door before stepping inside. He glanced up from his desk, waving me in. "Leo, what's up?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. I kept my tone casual. "Noah, I could use a favor," I said. "I'd like to request a business trip to the production site in the next city. It's been a while since anyone checked on things, and I think it's overdue." Noah raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "A business trip? That's not usually your thing, Leo." I shrugged, trying to look relaxed. "Yeah, I know. But I've been under a lot of stress lately, and I think getting out of town for a bit could help. Plus, it's a good chance to make sure everything's running smoothly over there." He leaned forward, tapping his pen thoughtfully against his desk. "You know, I have been meaning to send someone out for an inspection. This could be a good opportunity for you." "Exactly," I agreed, my tone even. "I'd only need about a week." Noah nodded, seemingly sold. "All right, I'll get the paperwork sorted. You'll have everything you need by the end of the week." "Thanks, Noah," I said, letting some genuine appreciation slip into my voice. This was the perfect alibi, everything I'd need to make my absence airtight. Later that day, I got the official documents. Signed papers, company authorization, the works. By the evening, I was ready to set the next stage of my plan in motion. As Mia and I sat down for dinner, I made a point of casually showing her the paperwork. "Looks like I've got a business trip coming up," I said, sliding the documents across the table. "I'll be gone for a week starting Monday." She glanced at the papers briefly, then handed them back with a nonchalant smile. "A week, huh? Well, I'll miss you, but work is work." "Exactly," I replied, keeping my tone light and casual, as though this was nothing out of the ordinary. She didn't suspect a thing, and that's exactly how I wanted it. Over the next few days, with my alibi securely in place, I began putting the rest of my plan into action. I reached out to a group of young event planners who specialized in flash mobs and public stunts. After some searching, I found a team that was intrigued by my unique request and eager to take on something a little unconventional. We met at a small cafe a few miles from my house. As we sat around a cramped table, I laid out every detail of what I wanted, how it had to be staged, every piece of the setup crafted to leave Mia utterly rattled. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about making her realize she wasn't untouchable. Humiliated and left questioning her own reputation. That's what I wanted for Mia. Nothing too cruel or over the top, but it had to be calculated, unforgettable, and leave her with a taste of her own medicine. "So, you want us to stage a show?" one of the event organizers asked, intrigued but clearly a little puzzled. I nodded, my expression firm. "Exactly. I want something that'll make her think twice. Shake her to the core." But without crossing the line, the group exchanged glances, their wheels already turning. Then one of them, a guy with a sly grin, leaned forward. "We can do that. Trust me, if you want her to feel the heat, we can deliver." By Monday morning, I was off on my business trip, every piece of paperwork in order. Mia kissed me goodbye at the door without a second thought, completely convinced that everything between us was fine again. She had no idea what was waiting for her. The day began like any other for her. After getting ready, Mia stopped by her usual cafe near the office, the warm scent of fresh pastries and brewing coffee welcoming her inside. It was her little daily escape, a place where she could relax before work. She ordered her coffee and reached for a cup, when a man in a sharp business suit appeared beside her. "Oh, it's you," he said, his voice dripping with exaggerated warmth. He looked at her with a faint, knowing smile. "I recognize you. You're the one who's so generous with her colleagues, right?" Mia froze mid-reach, her heart skipping a beat. His words hit her like a slap across the face. "Excuse me," she managed to stammer, her voice shaky and unsure. The man chuckled, his gaze holding a twisted amusement. Just so kind of you, really. Not many people would be that giving to their coworkers. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Mia rooted in place, stunned and bewildered. She stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It must be some kind of mistake, she told herself, shaking her head as she grabbed her coffee and croissant. But as she sat down, her mind raced. Who was that man? What did he mean by generous? The next morning, Mia returned to the cafe, determined to brush off the strange encounter as a one-off incident. People made weird comments all the time. It didn't have to mean anything. But as she stepped up to the counter, an elderly gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit shuffled up beside her. He turned to her with a warm smile, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Oh, madam," he said, his voice dripping with admiration. "I've heard about your generosity. It's truly inspiring. Not everyone would sacrifice so much for career success. It's a real feat of selflessness." Mia's face drained of color, her heart hammering in her chest. She blinked at the man, her stomach twisting as his words settled in. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But the man simply smiled, tipped his hat, and walked away, leaving her standing there trembling. This time, she couldn't shrug it off. Something was going on, and it was starting to feel like the walls were closing in. "Whisper." Mia's voice barely came out as she tried to process the elderly man's comment. The man, clearly amused, waved a dismissive hand and chuckled. "Oh, don't be modest. Word spreads fast about folks like you. Always so selfless, so accommodating at work. Quite the reputation you're building," he said with a smile before turning and shuffling away. Mia's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee. I could almost picture her confidence visibly shaken as she wondered just how much that stranger really knew. The rattled look on her face, the way her mind must have been racing. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. She stumbled out of the cafe looking dazed and paranoid, no doubt feeling a tight knot of unease creeping into her chest. As she made her way back to the office, I bet she kept telling herself to shake it off. But I knew better. Her thoughts would keep circling back to that night with Oliver. The one night she thought nobody else would ever find out about. Now, two complete strangers in as many days had dropped unsettling hints, and I could tell the paranoia was starting to sink in. By midweek, it was obvious Mia was on edge. At home, she looked like a nervous wreck, jumpy, wound tighter than a spring. Her eyes darted around like she was constantly on the lookout for something, and her usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be found. She might have tried convincing herself that the first two encounters were just coincidences, but deep down, I could see she was crumbling. And then, there she was again at the cafe trying to stick to her routine. I imagine she stepped inside that morning with a sense of dread creeping up her spine, the same dread that must have been eating at her all week. She placed her order and waited, probably scanning the room, her nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Just as the barista called her name, it happened again. Another young woman, this one balancing a tray full of drinks, stopped beside Mia and gave her that look. The one that said, "I know something you don't want me to know." "Oh, it's you, isn't it?" the woman said with a too bright smile. Mia froze, and the woman leaned in slightly, her grin widening. "My friend works with you. She told me how kind you are, especially to the men at the office." Then, like it was all just a big joke, the girl winked. "Thanks for being so caring," she added with a sugary sweet tone before turning away. Mia's face must have gone white. Her stomach must have dropped like a stone as the words hit her, each one landing with brutal precision. Grabbing her coffee, she fled the cafe, her steps quick and panicked. By the time she made it back to the office, she was in full-blown panic mode. That afternoon, when she finally called me, I didn't even need to hear her tone to know she was rattled. It was written all over her rushed, shaky words. "Leo, something really weird is going on," she blurted out the second I answered. "People, strangers, they're making comments about me, about that night. It's like they know." I listened in silence, my irritation bubbling up as I let her ramble. Did she really expect sympathy from me? Did she think I'd just jump to her rescue after what she'd done? This mess, Mia, I said finally, my voice sharp. Why are you bringing this up again? We agreed to let it go. Her voice cracked as she kept going, practically begging me to listen. I know, but this feels different. Someone spreading rumors? Or, wait, are you involved in this? I clenched my teeth, barely keeping my composure. The audacity of her accusation made my blood boil. Mia, are you serious right now? You think I'd waste my time spreading this around? I've moved on. Why can't you? She tried to cut me off, her voice frantic, but I wasn't about to let her drag me into her spiral. I had no patience left. Mia, listen, I said sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. I'm busy. I don't have time for this. Without waiting for her reply, I switched the call to video, showing her where I was. Standing on the factory floor in a hard hat and safety vest, I turned the camera so she could see the equipment buzzing around me, the noise in the background making it clear I was actually working. See? I'm here, doing my job, I said flatly. I don't have time to care about the past. Stop calling me with this nonsense. Her face fell, her expression crumbling into something almost pitiful. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thin and shaky. It's just strange. I've got to go, I said, cutting her off again. Don't call me unless it's important. And with that, I ended the call, not bothering to hear her response. I knew she wouldn't call again after that, but it must have gnawed at her, probably more than she cared to admit. From the way she carried herself in the days that followed, it was clear she couldn't shake the paranoia. She must have felt like every pair of eyes was watching her, that everyone knew her secret. I could only imagine the moment it hit her. Oliver. He was the only other person who knew. She must have convinced herself he'd let something slip, or worse, that he was the one behind the rumors. The panic inside her would have twisted into something sharper, more urgent. I pictured her storming into Oliver's office, her nerves frayed and her temper barely contained. She probably shut the door without saying a word, her face a mask of barely restrained fury. Oliver, she would have hissed, leaning in so no one outside could overhear. Did you tell anyone about that night? Poor Oliver would have looked up, caught off guard and unsure what she meant at first. Mia, what are you talking about? Her eyes would have narrowed, her voice sharpening with accusation. You know exactly what I mean. Did you slip up and tell someone? I imagined the color draining from Oliver's face as the meaning behind her words sank in. No, Mia, he stammered, clearly panicking. I wouldn't, but she wasn't buying it. Seething, she leaned in closer. Don't lie to me, Oliver. If management finds out, we're both done here. You know how strict the company is. Oliver's hands went up in surrender, his fear written all over his face. Mia, I swear, I haven't told a soul. I wouldn't risk my career over this. She stared him down, searching his face for any hint of dishonesty. But all she saw was confusion and fear. Realizing it wasn't him, she straightened, the fire in her eyes dimming slightly as her thoughts spun out of control. If it wasn't Oliver, then who? She left his office in a daze, feeling more lost than ever. Every strange comment, every unnerving encounter replayed in her mind like a looping nightmare. None of it made sense. A cold dread settled over her as she wondered if she was losing her grip on reality, or if someone was deliberately targeting her. The rest of her day dragged on, every minute weighed down by paranoia. By the time she left the office, her nerves were completely shot. Clutching a folder of documents to her chest, she stepped outside, lost in a whirlwind of anxious thoughts. Then, out of nowhere, a young guy bumped into her, knocking the folder from her hands. Papers scattered across the pavement in a messy pile. Oh, I'm so sorry, he said quickly, dropping down to help her gather them up. Mia crouched down too, her hands trembling as she tried to collect the scattered pages. Her mind was already spinning, and this was just one more thing to throw her off balance. Barely keeping her frustration in check, Mia muttered, "It's fine. My fault," as she snatched up the last of her scattered papers. "Thanks for the help," The guy crouched nearby gave her a strange smile, his eyes glinting with a look she couldn't quite place. I could picture the scene as if I were there, watching his smug expression as he looked Mia up and down, brushing himself off. His voice was smooth and dripping with something unsettling as he said, "No need to thank me." Verbally, he stood, flashing a grin that must have made Mia's skin crawl. "How about a night with you to show your appreciation for saving those precious documents?" Mia's face must have drained of color. Her eyes locked on his, wide with shock and fury. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice trembling, a mixture of anger and disbelief. But the guy didn't back down. His grin widened, his tone sleazy as he continued, "Oh, come on. I can see it in your eyes. You're the type who likes to be generous, especially when it helps someone's career." That was it. Mia's temper snapped. Before she could stop herself, she hurled the folder right at him. "You sick bastard!" she shouted, her voice shaking with rage. "Get away from me!" Instead of looking scared or apologetic, the guy let out a sinister laugh, the kind that sends chills down your spine. Then, without another word, he bolted down the street, disappearing before Mia could even think of chasing after him. She stood there, frozen, her entire body trembling with a cocktail of fury, humiliation, and fear. It was like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, like the whole world was conspiring against her. Everywhere she turned, it felt like someone was mocking her, reminding her of that night with Oliver. That evening, Mia sat alone in her dimly lit living room, clutching a glass of wine in hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She barely touched her dinner, too distracted by the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in her head. Every event from the past few days played on a loop, over and over, like a cruel film she couldn't turn off. No matter how much wine she drank, she couldn't calm her nerves. The unease sat heavy in her chest, refusing to let go. I could imagine her staring blankly at the wall, feeling like she was unraveling at the seams. None of it made sense. Who were these people? How did they know about her? Or worse, was she imagining it all? The guilt over what she'd done with Oliver was clearly eating away at her sanity. She didn't want to admit it, but the paranoia was becoming too much to handle. With trembling hands, she finally grabbed her phone. She opened her browser, her fingers hovering for a moment before she hesitantly typed, "Psychotherapist near me." The list of names and numbers that appeared on her screen stared back at her like a taunt. She didn't move, just sat there, the glow of the phone reflecting on her face as the realization set in. She needed help. Either someone was orchestrating a cruel, elaborate game to torment her, or her mind was starting to betray her. Either way, Mia was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. By Friday morning, she was barely holding it together. Her nerves were shot, her composure worn thin after everything she'd endured. Determined to avoid another humiliating encounter, she kept her head down, moving cautiously through her day, the weight of paranoia pressing on her with every step. Mia had made up her mind. No coffee stops, no lingering outside, no opportunities for another encounter to knock her off balance. She would head straight to the office, bury herself in her work, and try, desperately, to push this nightmare out of her mind. With that plan set, she arrived early, hoping for a quiet, uneventful day. At first, it seemed like it might actually work. By the time her coworkers began trickling in, Mia was already at her desk, typing furiously, her focus locked on her screen. The usual morning chatter filled the room, but for the first time all week, Mia felt like she had a grip on things again. A small sigh of relief, probably her first in days, escaped her lips. Finally, some peace, but it didn't last. Not even an hour later, the office door swung open, and in walked a courier, struggling to carry a massive bouquet of red roses. Heads turned immediately, curious eyes following him as he strode into the middle of the office and cleared his throat. "Delivery for Mia," he announced, his voice loud enough to echo. Mia's stomach twisted, heat creeping up her face as every pair of eyes snapped to her. The whole office was watching now, smirking, whispering, their attention laser-focused on her. She stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and approached the courier, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't order anything," she said sharply, her tone edged with panic. "Why are these flowers addressed to me?" The courier shrugged, looking innocent, as he reached into the bouquet and pulled out a small card nestled among the roses. Clearing his throat dramatically, he began to read the note aloud, loud enough for the entire office to hear. "For the most alluring and divine Mia, who made me happy that magical night. Signed, Oliver." For a split second, the room went dead silent. Then the laughter began. Whispers erupted, murmurs buzzed, and the sound of poorly concealed giggles filled the air. Mia stood frozen, her face ghostly pale, the blood draining from her cheeks as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The judgmental stares from her coworkers felt like lasers burning into her skin. Some were trying to hide their smirks behind their hands. Others didn't even bother. Then came the snap. In a burst of fury, Mia lunged forward, knocking the bouquet from the courier's hands. Roses scattered across the floor in a dramatic, crimson mess. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her humiliation and rage. "What kind of disgusting joke is this?" The laughter didn't stop, though. Her co-workers exchanged knowing glances, some chuckling under their breath, others just openly enjoying the chaos. "Mia, calm down," one coworker tried, her voice dripping with fake concern. But the smirk on her face said otherwise. She was clearly reveling in the drama. "Though, from what I hear," she added, her tone thick with innuendo. But Mia wasn't calming down. She was unraveling. Her nerves, already worn to the breaking point, snapped completely. It was her worst nightmare playing out in real time. And the icing on the cake. Oliver wasn't even there to explain himself. As fate would have it, he'd been called to another office by their boss that morning, leaving Mia to face the humiliation alone. Her shouts echoed through the office, her fury filling the space as the courier backed away slowly, looking like he wanted to disappear. Just then, the door to Mr. Brooks's office opened. The door to Mr. Brooks's office flew open, and out he came, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. He stopped short, taking in the chaotic scene. Mia shouting, the bouquet scattered across the floor, and the courier inching toward the exit like he couldn't leave fast enough. "What the hell is going on here?" Mr. Brooks demanded, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room before landing on the card lying among the roses. He bent down, picked it up, and scanned the words, his jaw tightening with each passing second. His face hardened, the lines around his eyes deepening as he held up the note. "Mia," he said sternly, fixing her with a pointed stare. "What is this? What's going on? And how am I supposed to make sense of this?" Mia, still shaking with anger, turned to him, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words but couldn't find them. Her face was flushed, her expression flickering between rage, shame, and panic. All around her, co-workers whispered louder now, their judgmental stares cutting into her like knives. The room buzzed with barely contained gossip, the occasional smirk or stifled laugh fueling her growing humiliation. Mr. Brooks, however, wasn't about to let this drag on. His voice grew sharper. "Mia, I'm asking you a question. Did Oliver send you these flowers?" He held up the card again, his gaze narrowing. The room went deathly silent as he continued. "Are you two in a relationship?" His tone was biting now, edged with suspicion. "Mia, you're married, and you know the company policy on interoffice relationships, don't you?" "No," Mia screamed, her voice cracking. She was visibly shaking now, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she tried to force out the words. "This is all a setup, a sick joke. I would never—" But her words faltered, catching in her throat. Her breathing was shallow, and her voice, once filled with fiery outrage, now sounded thin and brittle. Mr. Brooks eyed her carefully, his suspicion deepening. His tone softened slightly, but it still carried weight. "Mia," he said slowly, "you're not making any sense right now. You're acting irrational. If Oliver's involved in this, I need to know. Otherwise, you're putting your entire career at risk. Mia's eyes darted around the room, desperate for an ally, but all she saw were her co-workers' stares. Judging, whispering, laughing. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the entire office had turned into a trap she couldn't escape. "It's not true," she shouted again, but her voice lacked conviction. It sounded hollow, almost pleading. "I don't know what's happening. Someone's trying to ruin me." I could picture her falling apart right there, standing at the center of that mess, surrounded by people who were clearly enjoying the spectacle. Mr. Brooks took a long, measured breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. He could see she was unraveling. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembled, and her words were a chaotic jumble of panic. "Mia, you need to calm down," he said, his voice firm but with an undertone of understanding. The office, however, was far from calm. Some of Mia's co-workers were biting back smirks, while others didn't even bother hiding their amusement. Whispered comments and muffled laughter spread like wildfire, the tension in the room growing with every passing second. Mr. Brooks could tell the situation was spiraling out of control. For the sake of the office and Mia's increasingly fragile state, he had to defuse it. Clapping his hands sharply, he raised his voice. "All right, everyone, enough gawking. Back to work. This is a workplace, not a circus." He forced a smile, his attempt at easing the mood painfully obvious, but it worked enough to get people moving. The crowd began to disperse, the chatter dying down slightly as people reluctantly returned to their desks, though the air still buzzed with murmurs and knowing glances. Mia, though, remained standing in the middle of the room, shaking, the weight of her humiliation pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Mr. Brooks glanced at her again, the faintest flicker of concern in his eyes, but even he couldn't mask the doubt lingering in his expression. Mr. Brooks let out a low chuckle, his attempt at diffusing the tension painfully awkward. With a forced, playful tone, he said, "Mia, maybe take a couple of days off while we sort this out. And hey, maybe a lie detector test for you and Oliver could clear the air." "Huh? Trust but verify, right?" He chuckled again, trying to pass the whole situation off as a misunderstanding. But he had no idea just how close to the edge Mia already was. Something inside her snapped, a dam bursting with the force of all the humiliation and fury she'd been holding back. "Yes!" she screamed, her voice raw, reverberating through the stunned office. "Yes! I slept with Oliver." The entire room went dead silent, every head whipping around to stare at her. "I rode him like a young stallion," she shouted, her words dripping with defiance and spite. "And I enjoyed every second of it. And the rest of you," she turned, her eyes wild, scanning the room. "You're just a bunch of miserable, nosy bastards with nothing better to do than pry into other people's lives." Gasps filled the room. Co-workers exchanged wide-eyed glances, the shock of what she'd just said settling over the office like a suffocating fog. No one dared to speak. Mia's face burned crimson, her hands trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. She was unraveling, barely able to hold herself together, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. With a frantic, almost feral energy, she grabbed her purse and bolted toward the door, her sobs breaking the stunned silence as she shoved her way out of the room. But she didn't get far. Just outside, she nearly crashed straight into Oliver, who had just returned from his assignment. He stopped dead in his tracks, his usual calm demeanor replaced by pure confusion as he took in her disheveled state. "Mia," he started, his voice uncertain. Before he could get another word out, Mia turned on him, her voice thick with anger, humiliation, and despair. "Tell them, Oliver," she screamed, her tears flowing freely now. "Tell them how we were rolling around at your place. They're all dying to know the details, because their lives are just so boring and gray. Stuck in this miserable little office." Oliver froze, his face turning ghostly pale as her words hit him like a sledgehammer. His eyes darted nervously toward the open door, where their co-workers had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. Their shocked faces were like a wall of judgment pressing in on him. "And Mia, why?" he stammered, his voice weak and almost pleading. "Why would you tell everyone? That was That was our secret. His words hung in the air, but there was no taking back what had already been unleashed. Mr. Brooks stepped forward then, his earlier humor completely gone, replaced by a heavy, unrelenting seriousness. His gaze shifted from Mia to Oliver, his tone sharp and cold. "So it's true," he asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "There really was something between you two?" Oliver looked down at the floor, his face ashen and his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the moment had crushed him. "I didn't tell anyone," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I swear I didn't." Mr. Brooks pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling sharply as frustration etched itself into every line of his face. "Well, that's it then," he muttered, his tone low but audible to those closest to him. Turning to Oliver, he shook his head. "We're going to have a serious conversation. Right now." Without another word, he motioned for Oliver to follow him back into his office. As the door clicked shut behind them, the rest of the staff erupted into a storm of murmurs. Whispers filled the room, hushed comments flying between co-workers as they exchanged knowing glances. Every single one of them was buzzing about what they just witnessed. And Mia? She was nowhere to be seen. The fallout from Mia's explosive confession, her breakdown, and Oliver's stunned reaction had thrown the office into chaos. By all accounts, no one got any work done after that. When Saturday rolled around, I returned home, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and curiosity. I'd set everything in motion with Mia's downfall, but I hadn't anticipated just how far things would spiral out of control in my absence. The moment I stepped through the door, I could feel it, the tension hanging thick in the air. Something was wrong. I found Mia sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a glass of wine in her trembling hand. Her eyes were wild, darting around like a cornered animal, her entire demeanor teetering on the edge of desperation and madness. This was a woman who once carried herself with unshakable confidence. Now, she looked utterly broken. The second her gaze locked on me, her face twisted into pure fury. "You!" she screamed, springing to her feet so fast she nearly knocked her chair over. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger at me. "You did this. You set me up, didn't you? You planned all of it." I instinctively took a step back, raising my hands in mock surrender, playing innocent. "Mia, calm down. What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." But she wasn't hearing a word of it. She stormed toward me, her eyes blazing with rage and desperation. "You wanted to ruin me. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone." "Mia," I said softly, keeping my voice steady and even, "I'm your husband. Why would I do something like that? I didn't arrange anything. Let's just talk. Okay?" But she was beyond reason. Her hands were trembling violently as she closed the distance between us, her face pale and contorted with anger. Then, without warning, she spun around and lunged for the counter. My heart skipped a beat as she grabbed a large kitchen tool, a butcher knife, and turned back to me, her expression crazed, her grip on the blade tightening. "I'll make you pay for this," she shrieked, waving the knife in my direction. "You think you can destroy me and just walk away?" My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, slowly stepping backward as I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone. "Mia," I said, keeping my voice low and firm, "put the knife down. You're not thinking clearly. You need help." But she wasn't listening. Her eyes narrowed, her knuckles white as she tightened her grip on the blade. "You ruined my life, Leo," she ranted, her voice trembling with fury. "You made me look like a fool. You set me up, you monster." Her voice kept rising, her words growing more frantic, until I heard the pounding of fists against the front door. The police had arrived. Within moments, they burst into the room, quickly assessing the scene. Mia, still waving the knife, was screaming incoherently, her words a jumbled mess of rage and heartbreak. "Ma'am," one officer said gently, holding his hands out in a calming gesture. "Please, put the knife down." They approached her carefully, their movements measured and deliberate. She resisted at first, shrieking and flailing, but they managed to disarm her without incident. As they led her away in handcuffs, her face was a mask of anguish. Her words tumbled out in a broken stream of accusations and pleas, but none of it made any sense. I stood there, frozen, watching her go. My emotions were a tangled mess, a strange blend of pity and relief. She was gone now, lost to her own madness. And it was finally over. Later, at the hospital, the doctors confirmed what I already suspected. Mia had suffered a severe nervous breakdown. They placed her under psychiatric care, where she could get the help she so desperately needed. As for me, I walked out of that hospital feeling like I could finally breathe again. For me, Mia's hospitalization was the perfect opening to finalize what I'd been planning for weeks. With her out of the picture, I moved quickly and decisively. The first thing I did was contact my lawyer. Then, I withdrew a significant sum from our joint account, transferring it into a private one she couldn't touch. From there, I drafted the divorce papers, making sure every detail was airtight. By the time Mia was discharged and returned home, the house was empty. The only thing waiting for her was a stack of documents on the kitchen counter, the divorce papers, and a simple note that read, "Do not contact me." It didn't take long for her anger to boil over. A few days later, she reached out, furious about the missing money, hurling accusations of theft my way. But I was more than ready for her. When we met, I kept my expression calm and unreadable, my tone cold and steady. "I didn't steal anything, Mia," I said, cutting through her tirade. "But I'll tell you this, I got footage from the house cameras. They recorded everything." Her face blanched as the words sank in. "That's right," I continued, leaning in slightly to deliver the final blow. "The cameras caught you coming at me with that knife. So if you're looking to play hardball, I can press charges for attempted murder." Her bravado shattered in an instant, replaced by sheer panic. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. "You've gone insane, Mia," I said, my voice like ice. "You did this to yourself. I tried to live the way you wanted, to pretend like nothing happened. But you destroyed everything with your lies and insanity." Her anger crumbled completely, and she whispered, her voice shaky and desperate, You can't do this." "Oh, I can," I replied, my tone cutting and final. "And I already have. You're not getting a dime from me, Mia. You've lost it all. And if you push me any further, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened." Defeated, with no fight left in her, Mia signed the divorce papers. Her job was gone, her reputation in shreds, and Oliver? He'd been fired, too. The scandal had spread like wildfire through their office, leaving neither of them with a shred of dignity to cling to. Meanwhile, I walked away free, unburdened by the nightmare Mia had created. My revenge was complete. I had been patient. I played my part perfectly. And in the end, Mia's own actions sealed her downfall.